rest of the panel to start off with a few minutes talking about the formative and constitutive role of communication and CSR. And then we will have each panelist to give a few minutes, and then I will give over the word to you. So we hope for an interactive session here. Thank you.
Thanks, Mette. So I start discussion. When Mette invited me to sit on this panel, I was surprised because my first reaction was, well, I don't work on communication. So what should I say? Then I realized that everything I do is on communication. I work with Andreas. Discourse ethics is basically nothing else than communication. But I don't want to talk about that. I've brought two thoughts that I would like to share on communication and where I see some potential for research in the future. When I started to work on CSR many years ago, one of the first things I did was I looked into tobacco industry, wondering whether one could really say that what they do is, if they engage in CSR, whether it makes sense to have CSR in a tobacco company. And I read a lot about them and what they communicated. And I realized that their way of talking about CSR was a bit different from any other industry. It was a very legalistic language, which brought me to this idea to say, well, probably we can draw conclusions from how they talk about CSR on what they think about it and what they really do. So can we look at the CSR report and say, well, this is a high performer, a low performer in CSR just by the way they talk about it. Of course, only until you publish the paper, so then they can perform what you found. But you can see that reports are very different. If you look at Monsanto, it's very legalistic. If you look at Patagonia, it's very ethical. So language games were right. And one thing that I was surprised by when I looked at the tobacco industry is the way they communicate about anti-smoking. So when they are forced to do an anti-smoking campaign, what do they actually say? Well, they say, well, don't smoke, you teenagers, because it's risky and it's for adults. And if you look into internal documents of Philip Morris and BAT, what they have said 20 years ago is, if we want to attract teenagers, we have to frame smoking as for adults and as dangerous. So they exactly use that insight now to talk about it, giving the impression that they are very responsible, but in reality, having the opposed effect. So analyzing how companies talk about CSR, in my view, gives us an idea about how they think and what we can expect from them to do. The paper that I wrote with Andy and Laura and Dirk about this shareholder value maximum, this creating shareholder value stuff from Michael Porter is similar. So if companies like Nestle speak about creating shareholder value, what does it tell us about what they really do? Or will this language push them into one or the other direction? And the second point, what I am increasingly surprised about is this science and evidence-free debates on various issues like global warming. So you can drown some people in data on global warming and they still would say, well, I don't believe it. It's a hoax. So obviously there's a clash of language games between what people believe, their values and their claims about causal relations, and the way we talk about these things, like global warming. And obviously, a scientific language game does not interfere sufficiently with the belief systems of people. So how do we frame messages on CSR in a way that those who reject the evidence-based approach listen and are open to discourse? These are my 2 points here.
Thank you. So as Mette mentioned in the introduction of me, I'm very interested in the ways in which communication constitutes organization. In particular, I'm interested in the ways in which communication constitutes our conceptions of authority. So I have authority and agency, and especially when we consider the organization, I'm committed to trying to pry that apart and trying to understand how it is that we talk in these registers about organizations, firms, as actors. And so wanting to sort of move in that direction and linking that with CSR discourses. I think I've got three points that I think are forward-looking, agenda-setting, when it comes to thinking about communication in CSR. First is to ask about the kinds of theorizing that we need to have, that we should develop for interrogating the question that firms are tools or game pieces or resources to advance the interests of a small group of people who control them. So typically, when we talk about CSR, quite frequently when we talk about CSR activities, we seem to make an equation that the interests, the beliefs, the attitudes of the people at the top of the organization are often what leads to socially responsible activities. They could be becoming a benefit corporation. It could be stopping some sort of kinds of environmentally degradatory activities. It could be almost anything, both pro and con. We tend to make that equation that it's the people at the top who have the authority to steer to manage the organization in a particular direction. But I'm not sure that we have the kinds of theorizing of authority to be able to make that connection and then intervene in that kind of work. And so the question that I'm very interested in is, so what kind of theory do we need to develop along those lines in order to pry that apart, in order to understand in greater depth what it is to say that authority, people in positions of formal authority, might steer the organization toward positive and negative outcomes. And so I'm a little apprehensive about leaving authority as role position, leaving authority as simply that which allows the person to take control of the organization. And authority then becomes some set of mutual obligations for thinking about shared direction, claims on activity, and that always happens in communication. So that's the first concern, first issue that I'm interested in. The second one is in an age of consumption and prosumption, production and consumption, where the organizational production happens increasingly beyond the boundaries of the organization, formally moves into communities of users, groups of people, well beyond the boundaries what we typically consider to be the organization. How might we foster forms of resistance, change, alternative possibility around the organization? So typically we think of CSR as an organizational responsibility. And if we think then about production happening well beyond the boundaries of the organization, moving toward that term that I mentioned, prosumption, how might we think about enrolling others in that production of organizational authority? So these two are in many ways I think are linked. The third point that I think is forward-looking is problematizing what we consider to be communication in the first place. So typically when we think of communication, as Dennis mentioned, sometimes we think of communication as a conversation, as a dialectic of conversations and texts. Sometimes we see it in fairly transmissive terms. Sometimes we see it as dialogue, how Habermas says. Often built into those conceptions of communication is some version of intersubjectivity, that what we are trying to do in communication is achieve intersubjectivity, some shared understanding and agreement between persons. This is sort of a thumbnail sketch of a lot of what we think about when we think about communication. Probably many people here are familiar with the work of Jodi Dean. Jodi Dean and her notion of communicative capitalism suggests that all those visions of communication are perhaps short-sighted, maybe just wrong. A person named Colin Grant suggests that this notion of intersubjectivity has never been verifiable in any way, and that what we should think about, Grant says, what we should think about communication is seen as porous, is something that does not achieve intersubjectivity. This notion of communicative capitalism is built on an idea of circulation, that circulation of messages and not persuasion, not the achievement of intersubjectivity, is really what communication is all about. And therefore, that notion of dialogue, understanding, and culture are not where we should be looking for the interesting What Dean then suggests is that we should be looking at the belief that we make a difference, and that in many cases our technologically mediated circulation of messages is what's perhaps more interesting, and that those circulation practices enable, especially online organizing, and at the same time that activities like branding, for example, revolve around images and efforts to make one's messages stand out amongst an ever-expanding universe of additional messages. And what matters for Dean is the ways in which our messages enter this stream of circulation. And it's not then about changing minds, achieving intersubjectivity. If that's a viable vision of communication, that challenges in many ways the visions of communication that underlie much of what we work in terms of CSR communication. Those are interesting issues to grapple with, and I'm interested in having a conversation here after this.
Thanks so much for inviting me. I'm coming from a different angle. I'm not a communication scholar, but I also realized I deal a lot with communication. I always talk about discourses and practices of CSR, amongst others. And I've done one study where we looked at, together with Dan Kerman, and how discourses and practices of CSR, the performative power effects, and in particular how they try to shape employees' identities, that is, tie employees to the organization. And we looked at this in the context of consultancy firms. And one of the things that was very clear, and that in fact the interviewees said themselves, how apolitical CSR is, or maybe apolitical is the wrong word, but how it's what Christina Garsten and Jacobson called post-political. So it focuses very much on issues we can all agree with. It's more central politics, and it's post-political, they would say, to the extent that it's communication which suppresses conflict and pretends, or gives an image of harmony, that things will work out in terms of the environment or social issues and so on and so forth. Now what I find very interesting is at the moment, I come from Germany, and not just in Germany, but in Europe, what's going on. We live actually in times where politics is, we live in very, very political times, and also where the center was right and left is no longer so clearly in many issues, it can't be placed. And one of the things I'm interested in is what happens to CSR if it tries to touch upon or in the communication refers to issues that actually can become very political and can lead to some kind of crisis when it comes to the stakeholders. In particular, I had a master's student look at a football club. Well, he's a big football fan, so he wanted this case. At a German football club, which is known to have also some right-wing fans. And this football club, what it tried to do now that the refugees arrived, is do a whole CSR campaign about welcoming refugees. And this completely, in Germany we would say, ging nach hinten los, had the opposite effect of what they tried to have, to construct themselves in the media with the image of being so open and so on and so forth. And it led to a huge right-wing upheaval and a lot of negative press. So what I'm interested in is what happens when CSR actually can no longer, or some of the issues can no longer be placed so easily in this post-political, harmonious, conflict-free zone, but actually touches upon issues that we don't have agreement in society. And right now, I think there are a lot of issues where it's more difficult to find, where it's so easy to find a harmony amongst all the stakeholders.
So thank you so much for the invitation. So as some of the scholars, I'm not really from the kind of communication gang, so I'm pleased to have been invited here. So thanks again for suggesting me to discuss about performativity that I've not really linked to any of my CSR works thus far. So I think I know a little bit about the CCO stream of study. I think it's a very interesting way of reworking those basic insights by John Osteen and using actor network theory in order to move forward this notion that you can do things through communication and that communication is profoundly constitutive of reality. My point would be more to encourage you to look at these other authors who have built on the similar insight like John Steen in order to cross-fertilize and maybe develop further many ideas from CCO, and to look maybe a little bit more across how different scholars who have used the notion of performativity. So for instance, in critical management studies, in order to denunciate or criticize the constant search for efficiency after Lyotard, I would encourage also people to look at how these mechanisms of performativity contribute to constitute identity. So how is CSR or the performance of CSR in organizational context contributing to shape and create and design new self, new identities. So I know that some work have been done, such as the one by Yana and Chairman, on a more critical perspective, but we could think that CSR identities may also enable people to do different things. So I think we need to have this critical angle, but I think there are a lot of uncertainty as to what is going to be the outcome of any kind of performance related to discursive CSR communication. Another stream of studies on performativity that has not been used that much in this field is about how to bring theory into being, and what is the role of scholars of concept in bringing into being this notion of stakeholder, for instance, or corporate social responsibility. So to what extent, I mean, very few organizations were using those kind of concepts 20 years ago. Now it's like part of the common language and of business people. And still scholars don't realize that they may have played a little role in that process by teaching stakeholder theory over the last 20 years or 30 years to people. So I think we need also to try to stop considering scholars and academics as a kind of blind spot in that process and start trying to understand what is the role of academics in the constitution of CSR communicatively. And that takes place through teaching activities, through the design of artifacts, and that could explain the reason why we are also furious about the success of Michael Porter and his creating shared value concept that is effectively maybe academically problematic, but still it does a lot of things in the world. It creates the possibilities for people to talk about CSR with their CFO, for instance, which was not possible before. It can create interest of other folks, so it creates a world of possibilities. So I think we should pay much more attention which type of CSR concept and theories have some kind of performative power or the capacity to transform and shape reality in different ways. And I think we should think about how we can do that as academics. And this may mean moving forward some of the distinction we lack a lot in the CSR field, like the distinction between normative and descriptive. It doesn't make any sense from a performativity viewpoint. Okay. A lot of this performativity work built on the assumption that knowledge is not a representation, and that constructing a representation is already adding to reality or transforming the reality. So you cannot separate anymore normative from descriptive type things. So I know it shakes a little bit some foundational papers and discussion, but I think if you take really seriously this notion of performativity, you will have to live with that and think through that in order to theorize. And I think it's a way that will help fix some of the issues that have been discussed before, maybe the issue of authority. I think you can find conceptual resources in order to better understand what authorize specific CSR discourse to do things in specific context. I think the last point is not to forget the materiality and the material embodiment. I know it's quite present in the CCO analysis already, but I think this is also an important part of the current conversations about performativity. And so I think here you have lots of conceptual resources to develop and move forward CCO, and maybe to reconsider some of the basic assumptions we use in the CSR scholarship thus far, and in order to move forward. So.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Janne. I think that was a great start on our little hour here. And now I want to invite you, to ask questions here to the panel. We have heard Guido talking about CSR communication and the paradox. I thought it was quite interesting with the tobacco as an example, how CSR communication paradoxically, in prohibiting certain ways of communicating, invites sort of those, actually in a counterproductive way, sort of invites what's the CSR, you say community doesn't want to be invited. So it's actually agitating or inviting the young people to smoke more by prohibiting it. I thought that was an interesting social dynamics here, and Tim talking about circulation of messages. I think that could be a really interesting concept to explore in a CSR context, and Jan talking about how CSR suppresses but also stimulates conflict, and thus the role of scholars, and also what you're talking about, JB, as sort of the normative, the descriptive being kind of superfluous when we take the transformativity seriously. So I would like to invite the floor.
Yes, I do read all of these people's work, and in particular the performativity work I see as very closely related to a lot of the communication themes that I'm very interested in. And one of the things that I think gets conjured up by the questions of performativity depends on which version of performativity you're working in. It's the polarity version of performativity. There are some different materiality kinds of aspects that get raised. And one of the things that I think communication theorizing, coming back to this introspective view, hasn't done a very good job of is highlighting those kinds of issues of normative and normative and descriptive within the performativity version of theorizing that was mentioned before. And so to come back to the beginning of the question, I personally see a great deal of frustration and boredom with questions of disciplinarity around these interests in CSR and communication, and talking from the field of communication becomes less and less relevant and interesting as a perspective. There are a lot of people who study communication, study CSR, in ways that I find very interesting, even if they don't affiliate with the same kind of department or disciplinary background that I am interested in. So I see a lot more conceptual overlap among the four of us here, at least from my perspective, than I do with many of the colleagues in my department. And so I find quite a bit of conceptual and empirical inspiration from people.
I think the tricky thing is not just that we have to read each other's stuff, it's that we, in addition, have to read the background material of each other. Just when I listen to Tim and his ideas that he brought in, citing Jody Dean, I've never heard the name before, but it sounds as if I must read that stuff now. Same with Jean Pascal and his performativity theory. There's a huge literature behind what each of us is doing. And I would agree, we cannot ask interesting questions in CSR anymore, in my view, that are not coming from an interdisciplinary background. Because these questions are interdisciplinary. And whenever I read a paper that is too much in the silo, I find it just boring. It's not interesting anymore. We have said too many things on too many aspects of it.
Yeah, I mean, my answer to this is always the phenomenon we're looking at is interdisciplinary in many ways, right? It touches on so many different issues, from politics and communication. We mentioned materiality, so given that the phenomenon lends itself to an interdisciplinary approach, I would certainly also, I wouldn't see why not. Like, what would speak against that? So,
but I think, I also read and use a lot of the works written by those people here. I just think, to me, I've always advocated for a very pluralistic approach to corporate social responsibility and using multiple ontologies and epistemological ways to make sense of it. So I don't think it would be different for the case of CSR communication. What could be useful is maybe to recognize or acknowledge what quickly it is doing before launching lots of very sterile debates that are just about because people may have different ontological assumptions and they drive different conclusions, and you have this kind of debates. And the bottom line of the controversy is, well, actually we have a different way of seeing the world. Yeah. So I think there is an opportunity to save a lot of time by recognizing this pluralism in a sense, and by trying to use it constructively in order to analyze this category of phenomena. here it really depends on the kind of ontological assumption you're working on. I think this, I would say, I would define myself more as a kind of soft constructivist in this regard, not necessarily as a radical one. So I think this notion that economists and financial people are not asking themselves those kind of questions. They would have usually a very realistic set of assumptions they work with, and still they had a capacity to transform the world in such a radical way through their theorizing and through the translation of their theory to tools and devices that have been used by actors. So I think there are a lot of things we as scholars can learn from that. And I think this way of seeing the world seems to be important. It doesn't mean there is no reality out there. Maybe there is a reality out there, or the reality, I mean, here I'm defending kind of ideological issue.
Yeah, but what is your position then? So when you reject this naive realism, what do you put instead?
Yeah, I think that there are capacity. I think the truth is always something that will be provisory, stabilized, thanks to a lot of devices. And so if you look at scientific activities and the social studies of science, which we one of the literature I read quite a lot, I would say this notion that there is a universal truth on which we can build is gone since a while in this field. So I would have a hard time accepting that we can construct like a definite truth about the world outside. So my approach in this regard is much more constructivist, but I don't think I would be as radical as some people could be, like considering, like, I mean, people from psychoanalysis, for instance, would go very, very far in this idea that everything is like in your mind and so on, and that the reality does not exist. So I think in between, I think this position can help by lighting a lot of category of phenomena, a lot of processes that are very interesting, that have been really understood in the field. So this is how I would position myself, knowing that I'm also completing different types of research using different types of ontological perspectives. So I don't feel completely pointed by one ontological perspective.
I mean, basically it's a question of philosophy of science you're asking, and for me there's a difference between the correspondence theory of truth and the Konsenstheorie der Wahrheit, the consensus theory, and I very much advocate the second one. So of course we agree to some extent to some kind of truth, but of course this truth also evolves. That's the first thing. The second thing is, talking about language doesn't mean that they're not real effects, right? It doesn't mean that it doesn't have practical implications. But nevertheless, to believe that the way we interpret the meaning these implications have, that they are kind of, that we can see this through the eyes of a realist, that's where I would disagree. So there is life outside language, but the way we perceive it, the way we talk about it, will always ultimately be through language. So in that sense, that would be my answer. So I don't think one has to have that dichotomy as stark as you make it, as if, you know, we are fantasizing everything. You know, there is a table. You exist, your body exists. That would be my answer.
All right, I'll take it back. So this is obviously a very minor, small issue in philosophy of science. This is huge. This is something that is probably not easily digestible here. But I would say two things. First, I think that there's a false dilemma, a false dichotomy between constructivism and realism, or constructionism and realism. And that quite a few people quite a few scholars are interested in versions of, say, performativity that try to transcend that dualism, that people from Deleuze all the way through Barad and Velikovsky are interested in suggesting that no, of course, language is not all there is, but we can move towards some version of post-human versions of performativity, to use Barad's term, to think about language as a participant in practices, but certainly not the only participant. And that what we then need to do, to come back to my interest in the questions of agency, that agency is never solo from this perspective, that humans don't have or possess agency, tables don't have or possess agency, discourses don't have or possess agency, then what we need to do then is move our attention from the human or the table or the discourse to conjoined practices. How is it that practices meld together, they stitch together, the practices themselves stitch together a variety of different sources of agency, such that we are talking about agency especially in the production of practice. And so our unit of analysis then becomes not the person or his or her intentions, or the identity, or the corporation, or the discourse. Instead, the unit of analysis becomes practice. That's quite a bit different in terms of struggling with how it is that you might put together a study of corporate social responsibility. But I think that's perhaps the area that is trying to transcend that question of dualisms, and a way to perhaps inject a different version of theorizing to CSR thinking. And like I started for a variety of forms of performativity, particularly dealing with that question. The second way that I might suggest an answer to this is to move the question down a level of abstraction, to say, what is gained and what is lost in particular organizing practices when we postulate a true material, true reality, truth of some sort? What's wrapped up in that discursive move? How is it that people do that making of the claim of truth? And what is it that performs in situ? So it's just another way of thinking about that question of truth that doesn't grapple with all those deep philosophical theory of science waters.
I've recently become a big fan of a young philosopher in Bonn who tries to bridge these two approaches. Gabriel is his name. He wrote a few books in which he claims that we make truth claims inside narratives. So, for instance, if we have a narrative on evolution, there is no place for blue unicorns in a narrative on evolution. But in the narrative of blue unicorns, there is no space for Batman or Superman, because they simply don't fit into that narrative. So we can look at these narratives and we can test whether something fits into it. Whether it is constructed or real is less relevant than whether it fits into a particular narrative. So we can argue that something is making sense and true inside the narrative. Inside the narrative of the blue unicorn, certain things are true and others are simply wrong. And I find this quite convincing.
Can I pose a question to that? So I'm not familiar with that work. Is that at all similar to the Boltanski and Giacomo economies of work that, or different discursive frames that suggest that there are visions of what the world looks like, and that we might be occupying different visions? Is this narrative? The other.
Yeah, I sometimes actually make a mistake.
Sorry, no.
No, I don't think it's like this. It's just that if we make a truth claim, let's say about gravity, we can only make this truth claim according to Gabriel in a particular narrative, not another one. Whether this is a paradigm or not, I don't think unicorns will be a paradigm. It's just a narrative, I guess. But we have to understand that something can only be true with regard to something else. But it can be true. Whether it is really true in the end, or if this is really a table, we still don't answer. But he would say the counterpoint that Feyerabend said that anything goes is wrong. But maybe for the first point shortly, I don't think that organizations speak, but you have dominating ways of speaking in organizations. So if you have less day, it's shared value. And this does something with those who think differently, because they might get silenced by the discourse of the dominating voices. My assumption is that you can differentiate between companies that are either following the legal language technically talk about CSR, or scientific one, or an ethical one, or an economic one, so does it pay the important stuff. So I guess these are 4 categories of speaking about CSR that I've seen in different companies.
Well, I think it has a lot to say, so particularly here, because it is, first of all, when you look at this football club campaign, it all started with the CSR campaign in terms of from the communications department, and that had a huge effect on Facebook groups were formed, and Twitter accounts, and a lot of right-wing tweets were produced and so on and so forth. So of course, when you study it very, very carefully, what is the framing of politics here? And in what ways, and it's the interesting thing and why to some extent CSR and politics, I wouldn't say therefore, it's wrong to say it's apolitical, of course very political, how it tries to preempt and redefine already certain issues in a particular way. And as I said before, so the concept of post-political particularly looks at how it tries to suppress conflict, how it tries to produce an image of a harmonious, of things which I believe are inherently conflictual, and tries to give an harmonious aura. So here we could look at the language that is used, the images that are produced, the framing in which it takes place, but also who communicates, and then how it's communicated. And I think of the issues I'm looking at, what I find so interesting, how this then can totally backfire, and what happens then. And there we can see also a big split between the official kind of communication, which you also said, right? Because usually CSR is what the official communications departments produce of the organization, and then the different communication channels the stakeholders might use. Both the employees, when they use Twitter or something private, but also the consumers. And with football clubs, the interesting thing is that fans are both somewhat consumers, but they actually see themselves almost as employees. So they're kind of in between position.
I'll just mention one other thing along these lines. And certainly in the line of work that's identified as CCO, there's a history of talking about questions of representation and authority. And so if you're interested in some of those issues, I'm happy to recommend some readings along those lines. But one of the things that I think is not problematized quite enough in those literatures in terms of the voice that represents the organization is the struggle over meetings, the struggle over authority in terms of authoring the organization, and then who or what or how that voice emerges as a representative of the organization. And I think that's too quickly, then in my opening claims, I was suggesting that that's too quickly ascribed to the person in control, the president or the CEO, or some other arm of the organization that equation of interests and authority is made. And I would recommend that perhaps we pay much more attention to that struggle. That means then investigating practices where we can actually see that and not taking the word of the CEO as the representation of the organization. Actually, one of the papers that we talked about today, Lisa's paper, does a nice job of looking at those questions of struggle. How is it that authority how is it that authority emerges from an ongoing struggle between various position actors?
Thanks. To react about your first point, I think we can even broaden the discussion, because it seems we assume implicitly the organization we're talking about is a corporation with executives. And I think it could be really interesting to think about how alternative organizational forms that could be more responsible in many regards and performing to be. And I think here those problems of authority, of whose voices, or silence, would be also very important. But we can see that some organizations have kind of disappeared from the textbook. In economics, for instance, cooperative were a very important chapter of most economics textbook in the middle of the 20th century, and then progressively disappeared, and not taught into existence anymore by us as scholars, by other people. And I think this relates also to the question of what kind of legal device helped to turn into existence some types of organizations. So I think the corporation movement, for instance, is interesting in this regard. because it creates new affordance to really introduce different types of organizing. So I think here there are more and more thinking about alternative organizational form, and I know Consuelo was at a workshop in Chile where we were discussing those kind of issues. I've personally been working with some colleagues on a project on worker cooperatives in Argentina, and trying to understand the role of academics in maintaining the existence of this organizational form in the political space, in a context where a lot of politicians will say actually they're just another kind of cooperatives, they're not that important. They were important after the crisis, but actually there are less and less of them, and they're going to disappear. And all the scholars are just counting the number of organizations, demonstrating that there are more and more of them, and trying to bring them into existence and so on. So I think, in a sense, that there are more issues beyond simply the kind of working or functioning of organizational form that we know and that are as they are. And we also need to think about this alternative organizational form we want to perform through its different communicative device approaches.
So I think
The convincing narratives are read recently aiming at theorizing that. In the case of the creative shared value concept, for instance, were based on ethnography. So I think that's like an obvious way to where to look. But I think you can also think about some specific events or what you could call maybe performative moments, like moments that play a fundamental role in terms of communication, like field configuring events, as we call them in institutional theory. They play a very important role in terms of constituting the authority of specific concept or way of seeing the world. So I think you can think about different devices and the way of looking at that. And in a sense, because the technology now has transformed so much the nature of communication through the imagery device, I think there are much more opportunities to look at how things are getting constituted without necessarily having to be there as an ethnographer, because you can follow a lot of this development through different media that people are using. That becomes the most natural way of communicating for some people in PR services, for instance. So I think ethnography seems to me the best way of documenting those kind of things, but I know it's quite demanding from a methodological viewpoint. And I think if you look at how people were looking at those kind of tricky things in actor network theory, case studies, historical case studies, can also be quite relevant in some cases. Even so, you cannot analyze the instantaneity of those effects, but you can still sometimes reconstruct them export as well. But there are clear methodological challenges as soon as you start really buying into these assumptions, especially at the ontological level, and it really transforms the way also you see yourself as a researcher in the process, and you start really thinking much more reflexively about what you're doing in collecting this type of data and that type of context and collecting this type of analysis. So I think there is a need for more reflexivity from a methodological viewpoint, for sure.
usually it starts with events like that, when you have a workshop, then you have special issues. So I think all the institutionalizing mechanisms are already starting to be in place. So, and I think a field, one also see lives from us being outside and then coming together. So I see it more as a coming together in a fluid way is the way to go. So I wouldn't know what much else we could impact.
I don't believe in that. I believe what you're saying, that these in-between papers don't get published. I think good papers always get published.
There's a lot to that question. Let's see. So, a couple of responses. First, I don't see communication as being communication itself as a discipline, nor the CCO theme within the communication domain as being either lofty or self-sealed. And so that characterization of sort of an implicit superiority being claimed is a foreign idea to me. I think there might be, communication has long had this notion of being an outsider trying to bang on influence of other conversations and trying to get in. So maybe there might have been some of that in that conversation that you had. But at least I see communication as being a big tent kind of both discipline and concern. So as I mentioned in my opening remarks, I'm much less concerned with disciplines than I am with shared interests. And when I go to communication conferences, and like I mentioned in my department, I find a great deal less similarity with a lot of those people. But there are some shared interests in communication. But even within the field of communication, that notion that communication is constitutive is sometimes posed as a grounding assumption for all communication scholarship, but not everybody buys into that. And so I guess I would suggest that people within communication writ large need to come to that CCO frame to be able to do communication. And then within the CCO, as I mentioned, I have several criticisms of the CCO, of a CCO view, but the challenge also is that there are many CCO views, and they're not owned by communication or owned by particular people. And I think what a lot of the CCO people who are doing CCO work is that they're committed to being more ecumenical, to outreach. But yeah, there is an assumption that communication plays an important and constitutive role in thinking about organization. Now, what the hell is communication in that? So to make that claim then requires that we are very clear about what it is that we're talking about communication. Sometimes the CCO people are not terribly clear about what it is that they mean by communication, myself included. But there's an increasing desire to see communication as not merely the realm of the symbolic, to see communication as always already socio-material in its orientation, in its doing, which is why I suggested that the term practice is important. And then to think about the ways in which communication as an ongoing practice, this material discursive practice, always all the time, how it is that produces certain forms of reality, which is another term we're talking about as well. But I've got a lot more that I can say on this. I'm working on a book right now, so I don't want to recite the entire book.
Just to reflect on that, I don't know network communications. I think here we have to answer like with a Barretian post-humanist epistemology, we can bring in practice, identity, the actual doing of actors, so we're closer to like organizational reality. I would just suggest, in order to address Frank's comment, to engage reflexively with that, and what does it mean in terms of the type of practice that are going to be engaged in identity constitution by these groups in order to bring to be the field of CSR communication they want to make exist in the near future in academia. And I think here there are maybe a lot of resources in the different papers that are going to be discussed about how to do that and how to make this CSR communication field happen very concretely. I think you're the best place to think about that this forum and in different forum. So I think there is the question of engaging reflexively with the implications of the research we do as researchers and try to use that in order to move forward.
My first response is it depends on the question. That's the typical academic easy way out, right? But so that's in the end, I think that's simple. But to come back to my earlier point, what forms of communication? I think it's always got to be a version of practice. And so again, unit analysis should not be a single visual representation, a single picture. Should not be if you're trying to ask the kinds of questions that I'm asking, should not be the kinds of statements of particular persons situated in an organization, nor should it be statements of an organization, again, if you're asking the kind of questions that I'm asking, but rather to be paying attention to practice. And so if you're interested in negotiations, conflicts, and struggles of the meaning about who or what gets to represent the organization, if you're interested in the ways in which authority is negotiated from the very beginnings of an organization, so in startup phases, that you want to investigate the practices where those conflicts or those decisions are made and remade and investigated by situated actors. So again, I'm coming back to that sort of simplistic question of practice. Any notion of practice is also a fairly abstract notion, so of course more specificity would need to be added to any investigation from there. But my claim is that sticking with our sort of fairly conventional notions of units of analysis is probably not going to allow us to answer the kinds of questions that I was posing before.
What I find fascinating is to look at how leaders in organizations speak about CSR when they do not speak about CSR, but about something else. Because if you read communication on CSR by a CEO, it's normally not written by the CEO himself, and we all know that. So it's not what he or she should be thinking, but if you listen, for instance, to how the CEO of Volkswagen spoke about his management style, or how others speak about how he managed in the company, you learn a lot about what this guy is thinking about the role of business in society. So how do they speak when they're not controlled? Looking at discourses of CEOs, for instance, when they talk about something else and deriving something about CSR from that, because that would be interesting.
Yeah, and as I mentioned, in our case, we very much looked at all those kind of non-official forms of communication. So in the one article, we looked at how employees, for example, talk about CSR and how they interpret it. But in this other study now on the CSR campaign of the refugees, we'll be looking at Facebook, Twitter, and all these other forms. So much communication happens around the official communication. I think that's also very, very interesting to explore, particularly also where people say things anonymously, for example. So, because the big problem with CSR is it's so difficult to get behind the image. So how can you get behind it? And it's, I think, ethnography, but also looking at those spaces where communication takes place, where people do say things they wouldn't say in other forums.
I think there is something very interesting to play out about this over-framing or framing of CSR communication, like corporate interest, power interest, and all this role of authority in that process, and the overflows that still happen to a large extent, that things that are not controlled, that are linked, those different types of communication. And I think here there is a lesson maybe from like, the WikiLeaks of this world to learn, or whistleblowing, so how do you deliberately create this kind of possibility for overflows, or they are undermined still in some organization. So I think this kind of dialectical processes around communication is also really interesting to analyze in terms of the permanent attempt and investment of corporation in order to frame and control this communication, and the fact that technology now brings to a large extent these possibilities. And some very innovative social entrepreneurs are trying to use that. For instance, we had this person creating a new business model, stepping of one of my classroom and explaining that she would provide to all the people in the supply chain mobile phones so that they can take pictures, that they could provide on the internet to show permanently that the supply, like this dream of transparency, and showing that there is no issue, if there is an issue related to mistreatment or whatsoever, they're supposed to take a picture and provide it so that they could be aware of what's going on in the organization. So I think these technological things will transform and change the possibility of framing and the possibilities of overflows in this communication process. So I think that could be one way also of implementing the role of CSR into that, how to make it happen beyond the kind of controlled channels by corporations, by people involved. And it seems to me that there is like always possibility for emergence and intermittent effects. I think we all know organizations are so busy. Sometimes it's really, there are a lot of things that, I mean, you cannot control everything. Usually, even in very totalitarian organizations and governmental very well, there is room for improvisation, for emergence, for different things. And I think that could be an interesting focus for CSR communications.
Very much. And I think some of us remember talking about the unofficial, types of communication. Maybe maybe some of you also remember how Tony Hayward, then CEO, VP, in the wake of the BP oil disaster in Mexico Gulf, was saying, it's one thing I really want, I know there's a lot of things going on, it's a big disaster, but I really want my life back. I think that was also sort of a kind of really interesting, unofficial statement about his take on that crisis that the corporation he was employed by was causing. Anyway, thank you very much, madam. I think that I'll just say one thing about how do these sort of interdisciplinary, intercultural, at least in this case, it's interdisciplinary occurrences, or perhaps sub-schools, or perhaps ongoing themes that may develop. How do they occur? Back to your question, Frank, I think that the issue of CSR communication has been around for quite some time, but I think it's fair to say that it's also taken on different shapes, different tones, invited different people, as we've been going on since maybe 2006, 2007-ish, something I remember Julie Broker, George Cheney also publishing on these issues back then. But today it's very much, of course, in this context, the constitutive and formative role of communication and related to in the context of CSR that we discuss here. And of course I know that in other communication schools, we could say CSR and communication will take on a different or invite a different kind of theoretical inquiry than what we are trying to achieve in this workshop today and what we're trying to achieve with the special issue. So I think it's fair to say, Andy, that we are, as you said, we're not searching for competing truth or to determine which truth is the better. But I think it's also fair to say that it would be wonderful with this exploration of, so what does it mean for truth? The question that you sort of engaged us, the panel in here,